Evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji, and welcome to the fourth and final episode of the third edition of Beyond Contemporary Art series, conceptualized in association with Ranjit Hoskote. Began in 2015, we've held 8 robust episodes spanning 2 series, and each discussion is convened by Ranjit and continues to extend the invitation to respond to new developments and debates, revolutions and trends, preoccupations and passions of the globalized art world, and to reconsider the very fundamental role of art in the world we live in. Today's session, Artists and Activists and the Challenge of Climate Change, a panel discussion on artistic expression, art practice, ongoing activism in the midst of the current global climate crisis, presented by Art Musings Gallery and Avid Learning. This series is presented in conjunction with Art Musings Gallery's ongoing and soon to conclude year-long exhibition, the 20th, curated by Ranjit Hoskote, that celebrates 2 decades of this gallery. And I'd like to congratulate Shanti Chopra, Sangeeta, and the Art Musings team for this momentous occasion and also collaborating with us. It's been a sheer joy and pleasure through this year putting this series together, and we've had lots of fun, and hopefully for the 40th we'll be doing this, right? No, jokes aside, Yakov is here. Our speakers for the evening, urban activist Cyrus Guzder, dancer and choreographer Revanta Sarabhai, and our moderator for the evening, curator, poet, and cultural theorist Ranjit Hoskote. Before we begin the discussion, we're going to have a short dance performance by Revanta here, so please join me in welcoming him. And please remember, put your phones on silent. I know you're not going to get reception here, but when we go up for the talk later, you will. And start posting, reposting. Our handle is @Avid Learning, and hashtag is Learning Never Stops. Thank you very much, and look forward to this exciting presentation, performance, and discussion. Thank you. Thanks, Rupert.
Thank you. Good evening. It's lovely to have all of you here. We're going to be doing most of the talking upstairs, but I just want to give you a little bit of a context to the piece that I'm going to present. My work over the last few years has been using a 2,000-year-old art form, Bharatanatyam, which comes from Tamil Nadu, from the south, and using it to tell stories which are relevant to our times. And to do this, I often delve into mythology and find a way to get from there to the 21st century. So today's piece is in the form of a kirtan, which is essentially a devotional song. And typically in devotional songs, the dancer usually pays her or his respects to a particular deity and talks about the different aspects of that deity. And you know, in Hinduism, we have a very interesting concept of the trinity of gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara. And each of them have been attributed a sort of role. Brahma is said to have created the universe and to have brought into existence everything that we see around us. Vishnu is said to have sustained things. It's because of him that day after day, year after year, the world continues to revolve. And Shiva is considered the destroyer who, when the time is right, at the end of a kal or an era, will come to destroy everything into nothingness so that a new universe can come into existence. And this feeds into the Hindu philosophy of time being cyclical and never ending. So based on this idea, but with a little twist to root it firmly in today's context, I want to present to you this kirtana, which begins with the description of Brahma as the creator, with Vishnu as the sustainer, and then comes the twist. Brahma Maheshwara
அற்புதமும் மழகும் வலிமை திறமை பெற்றோம் அற்புதமும் மழகும் வலிமை திறமை பெற்றோம் பிறக்கின்ற பிறக்கின்ற மனித பிறவில் படைத்தான் பிரம்மா விஷ்ணு மகேஸ்வர ஆனந்த சயனனே இன்றளவும் இந்த உலகின் வளமையை காத்தவனே ஆனந்த சயனனே இன்றளவும் இந்த உலகின் வளமையை காத்தவனே அதன் நிர்வாகத்திறனும் நிலையான உறுதியும் சரிநிக வாழ்வாய் தந்தவனே அதன் நிர்வாகத்திறனும் நிலையான உறுதியும் சரிநிக வாழ்வாய் தந்தவனே பிரம்மா விஷ்ணு மகேஸ்வரா மலைகளை அழித்தோம் மலைகளை கரைத்தோம் மலைகளை அழித்தோம் மலைகளை கரைத்தோம் மதங்களின் பேரால் அடிபட்டிருந்தோம் மதங்களின் பேரால் அடிபட்டிருந்தோம் நிர்மூல கடவுளே நீலகண்டா இடுகாட்டு ஈசனை சந்திரசூடா கடவுளை நீல கண்டா இடுகாட்டு ஈசனை சென்ற சூடா எங்களை நாங்களே அழித்து கொள்வோம் எங்களை நாங்களே அழித்து கொள்வோம் எங்களை நாங்களே அழித்து கொள்வோம்.
Oh Shiva, we are destroying the earth ourselves. Perhaps we don't need you anymore.
இனி உங்க சேவையை தேவையில்லை இனி உங்கள் சேவையை தேவையில்லை.
Join us for the rest of the evening for the panelists.
Framing remarks, your words of welcome. I also want to thank everyone on Team Avid and Shanti, Sangeeta, Kasturi and everybody at Art Musings for what has been a really lively series of conversations. And we're now at the end of the series, so there's a certain sense of an ending. But I'm really honored and delighted to have as our panelists today Cyrus, Guzder and Revanta, Sarabhai, each of who brings to this discussion a long-standing commitment to questions of how best the growing imbalance between human desires and needs, between that on the one hand and the rhythms of the environment could be brought into reconciliation, and a critical awareness of everything that has gone wrong on the path of a certain kind of socio-economic development that we've chosen as a species, as a nation state. And the invocation, which is how I think of it, that we just had with Revanta downstairs, really foregrounds these issues for us by drawing a contrast between a more, if you will, cosmic or cosmological sense of forces in balance and what happens when those forces get thrown out of kilter. So I want to make a few framing remarks here before I go into the actual conversation. I want us to, as we all know, this is something we are living through. We are clearly doomed to be that generation or that set of generations which is moving purposefully towards the sixth mass extinction that this planet has known. So that's a very grim thought. And everything that we seem to need to do seems to be so micro level in terms of scale, and there are much larger macro level problems that no one seems to have a solution for. And calling this the Anthropocene moment, as many of us, certainly in the art world, do, may miss the point in a certain way. Because when you blame the entire species and suggest that this is just a continuous amplification of things that we've been doing wrong just simply by creating habitations and settlements and working with the environment, that is a very philosophical but probably a misleading way of thinking about this. I far prefer that part of the discussion that's led by thinkers like Jason Moore, who identify this fairly accurately as the Capitalocene phase that we are in. It has nothing to do necessarily with what we've done to our environment as a species, because in pre-capitalist times, there have been ways of dealing with these questions. What we today very easily call sustainability, that's been built into whether it's sacred culture or civic culture or ways of being and belonging. It's the machine of industrial capital and the Enlightenment. This is going to be a bit of a lecture, if you so, which I've tried to avoid in this series, but these things happen. They creep up on you.
As long as you allow us to protest.
You will have your moment. Yes, fortunately, I'm not the Home Minister, so I allow protest in all its diverse forms. So, what was the machine of capital really based on in the first place? Of course, we know that it has something to do with a historical moment that led people in the first place out of Europe and towards a program of expansionism that took in ultimately the whole globe. But as Akhil Belgrami, who's one of, I think, our finest philosophers today, as he points out, a lot of this was legitimized by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Because it's during the Enlightenment brought us many good things. The discourse of civil rights, a certain form of modernity, so this is not a critique of the Enlightenment. But it also transformed the way in which we looked at nature. From looking at nature, we began to interpret nature as natural resources. From looking at communities, we began to see communities essentially as populations that could be moved around and mobilized in different ways to serve capital. And we began to replace a knowledge to live by with an expertise in managing resources. Yeah, I'm crudely paraphrasing a marvelous passage in one of Belgrami's books. But this, it seems to me, is one of the root causes of what brings us here today. So I would really prefer Capitalocene to Anthropocene as we go along. And also to ground it in the context of deep time. When you think about just how long this planet has done perfectly well without us, and how in a relatively brief measure of time, we've managed to transform it, interrupt and disrupt its processes, something that has happened with great rapidity since the end of the Second World War. So it's very funny when you look back at documents like the Club of Rome, the Limits to Growth of 1970, people have been cognizant of this for a very long time, but it's only now that you see how we're actually transforming nature. So can one think of nature in a sort of romantic manner, something outside of oneself? Clearly not, especially when we're disrupting and changing it and rendering it in our image in some ways. So these are some of these. This would form a sort of backdrop to what we talk about today. And as we've done in the course of this series, I'd actually like to have the discussion begin with the practices of the speakers, their own journeys, and then we build onward to the great themes of, in this case, not only climate crisis, but also how people's practices, the practices of these individuals at this moment, how did those practices expand to meet other kinds of challenges? What is the nature of activism, and how does that play a role alongside art making or institution building, as the case may be? So I'm actually now going to begin with you, Cyrus. And you've been involved over a long period with both questions of urban design. You're a trustee of the Urban Design Research Institute, but also with questions of habitation and settlement. You've been long associated with the Indian Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore. And you've been involved in building forms of protest and building up opinion in questions, for instance, like the Coastal Road most recently. But can I take you back to a moment before all of that, when you studied with the Olchins, the great archaeologists of South Asia, Bridget and Raymond Olchin in Cambridge. And in the late 60s and early 70s, you were involved with an excavation at a Harappan site. Could I ask you to go back into your training in archaeology and maybe reflect on how climate crisis, I've now characterized it as something that emerged out of the capitalist era, but did it not play a role in the downfall of many of the great civilizations of antiquity? And what might the difference be between then and now?
So I have to give you my academic history, my life history, my career as an activist and a businessman in the next 3 or 4 minutes, or what is it? Yes. I will try. Oh, that's sweet of you, but that would not be fair to Revanta, okay? But as Revanta has now given us he's taken us through the entire creation, preservation, and destruction of the universe. And you did that in about 7 minutes. Yeah, it's a difficult record to beat. Okay, so I don't like to talk too much about myself and my academic work, but just a couple of sentences. I went to Cambridge in 1964 to study economics, based on the misguided view that would help me to be a good businessman when I returned to my father's business. It turned out to be ill-advised. Economics as taught in Cambridge is quantitative. It is Keynesian. It was pro-China and somewhat anti-Indian in those days, and I thought it would have given me nothing except a degree to come back and work in the Planning Commission. So, in the end of my first year, I abandoned economics. I must add that the driving force of that was my tutor at Cambridge, who I found to be most uninspiring. But he went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics, so I'm not sure whether I had any twinge of conscience about that. And then I switched to the Oriental Studies Tripos, where you have to major in a classical language, so I had to get up to scratch for my bachelor's degree in Sanskrit in 2 years, and then do a series of papers in Indian archaeology, epigraphy, literature, and history of art. So I finished that degree and came back to India, and my professor at Cambridge said, "Do you feel like joining me on some field work?" So I was thrilled, and the focus of archaeological activity in the 60s and 70s was very single-minded. There was a moment when our pride was punctured somewhat, and that was the moment of partition, when the line drawn through the states of Punjab, Rajasthan, and Kutch ended up by giving almost all the sites of the Harappan civilization to Pakistan. And we suddenly found ourselves left with almost no site of any significance, although we did have a very large amount of the debris and the fragments of pottery and the findings of all those excavations stashed up in the godowns of the Archaeological Survey of India in Delhi. And I think that the Pakistanis made many futile attempts to have some of that returned to them, which we staunchly resisted. So the quest was, could we find cities of the Indus Valley culture on the Indian side of the border? But unfortunately, if this was a riverine or a riparian civilization or culture, we had no great rivers flowing through Rajasthan at that time. There was one. It was the river Guzder, which is not a perennial river. But the interesting thing is that archaeologists who'd been wandering around the fossil terraces of the river had begun to find quite a lot of pottery which seemed to belong to the Harappan culture. So by the time Dr. Rolchin and I were wandering around southern Rajasthan, India had discovered quite a number of sites. The largest site at that time was called Kalibangan, close to the Rajasthan desert. S.R. Rao had discovered and excavated Lothal, which was a remarkable port or a maritime site in Gujarat. And so we took up the extraordinary ambition that we would try and go as far south as possible and discover an Indus Valley site on the outskirts of Bombay. Well, we didn't get that far, but we did stumble across a site in Gujarat near Valsad, and subsequently we excavated it and it was reported. Now that is just the storyline, but the learning was quite extraordinary for me. What we began to think about was how you construct the history, the story, the society, the culture, the behavior of a settlement or a group of people from what are actually just fragmentary remains. You cut through a slice of the earth, and you have to be extremely careful because archaeology is a destructive process. What you aim to find, you actually destroy in the process. You dig it up, and at the end of an excavation, you have mounds of earth, and you pull out whatever fragments of pottery or bone, at a later period coins, weapons, tools, and then you try and construct the story, but you have to be very careful that from every stratum that you extract material, you have developed, if possible, 2D and 3D drawings. You identify the stratum in terms of its soil composition, and you try and find some organic matter in there from which you can construct an accurate carbon-14 date. So by the time we came to the 70s and the 80s, the Archaeological Survey had done a pretty outstanding job. Sites were discovered all the way from Gujarat through Rajasthan up into Haryana and eastwards to the to the western part of the Indo-Gangetic Plain, where, by the way, the culture comes to an abrupt end, and there's a fairly long hiatus before you get the later cultures of the Ganges Valley, probably because at that time the Ganges Valley was highly forested, malaria was rampant, and until, shall we say, the residents of northern India and the Gangetic Plain had access to iron tools, it was very difficult to fell the forest. So there we are. Now, what was interesting is many intriguing questions came up, and quite a few of them, incidentally, have not yet been answered. The first was, and the obvious one was, you picked up potsherds, seals, which had little inscriptions on them, and the question was, what language was this in, and what was the meaning of these inscriptions? So you had S.R. Rao, who constructed a whole theory that it was a Proto-Dravidian language. You had an extraordinary Finnish archaeologist who's still practicing in Finland called Parpola, who ran early, at that time in the 90s, he ran computer runs in order to try and understand the location of symbols next to each other and their proximity, and came to the conclusion that it looked more like a Dravidian language. So if you could have two extreme views of two completely different schools of language, you would be reasonably entitled to discount both of them, certainly not to believe in one or the other. And I learned from Dr. Rolchen at that time that the only way in which you can decipher a script which seems to have now become unreadable is you need to have a couple of prerequisites. Ideally, you should have a bilingual inscription. Egyptian cuneiform, which covers extensively the tombs of the pharaohs in Egypt, could not be read until Champollion, in one of the Napoleonic expeditions in Egypt, found the Rosetta Stone, which had inscriptions in 3 languages, classical Greek, I think Aramaic, or it was another type of Greek, and cuneiform. So that's number one. Or you ought to know what the language is, in which case you can start reading it. And that is how Michael Ventris, an archaeologist who excavated the cultures of Mycenae, which were early Greece, lots of inscriptions, came to the conclusion that I must be able to read Greek into these. It must be a form of Proto-Greek. And he ultimately cracked the code, and you have all the early Greek inscriptions deciphered. Till today, we neither have a bilingual inscription, nor do we have a long enough inscription in order to be able to infer the syntax and therefore possibly the structure of the language. The second question was, who were these people? Where did they come from? And today there is still, as you know, a raging controversy. Last month I attended a lecture at the Asiatic Society given by Zamkhedkar, who was the director of archaeology. And he showed us that there were linguistic essays on where these people may have come from. There's archaeological evidence. There's increasingly evidence of DNA, because the remarkable thing is now you can extract cellular matter from the skeletons which are in the cemeteries of the Indus Valley. And so you begin to now create hypotheses looking back at the DNA of these people as to where they might have come from. And the current regime would like you to believe that nobody came into India from anywhere. Quite the contrary, we were the fountainhead of Aryan civilization, and we exported Aryan culture and our languages. But unfortunately, the linguistic, the way in which linguistics is now understood, clearly indicates the languages that we speak are descended from an Indo-European root, as is classical Persian, as is Vedic Sanskrit, and as is classical Greek. These are the 3 daughters of a mother language. That mother language doesn't exist, but it can be postulated as being an Indo-European language. And then, of course, the DNA evidence is also indicating that a large number of these people came from the region of the Caucasus, which then also gave, if you like, brethren who ran across the northern Mediterranean and then populated Europe. And the last question was, why did these cultures come to such a sudden end? And at that time, the question was, if these were riverine civilizations and they drew their economy from the planting of crops where the river flooded its banks, it was such an easy form of agriculture. You didn't have to plow fields, and the soil was continuously refreshed by the silt that came down from the higher mountains. The river went dry, and that was probably the reason why the cultures faded away. Why would the river have gone dry? At that time, we were talking less about climate change and more about the possibility that the whole of the northern Indian belt at the foothills of the Himalayas is tectonically very unstable. Remember that the triangular subcontinent of India made a great journey, having detached itself from the island of Madagascar some 60 million years ago, and floated towards, or shall I say, sat on top of a piece of earthen crust which moved and collided with the continent of Asia and uplifted the Himalayas. And that is why till at very substantial heights in the Himalayas, you still get a large number of marine fossils in the sedimentary soil, which clearly indicates that this was marine laid down silt which has been uplifted. And so the postulation at that time was the river Guzder, which is now often wanted to be attributed to the river Saraswati, and there's no reason why you can't give it that name, was captured by the Ganga when there was a tectonic movement and the river was then moved eastwards, and that could have been the beginning of the Yamuna River, which is a very recent river. So this is just to give you a flavor of the sort of ideas that the Archaeological Survey and subsequently all of us have been preoccupied with. So when we came to Valsad, there was not much to say. It was a late Harappan site, and just one more tiny microscopic piece in the jigsaw puzzle that we're building up about the early cultures of India.
Share this with Revanta. Cyrus, thank you for that, because quite often discussions about climate change, which are then braided in with other kinds of political questions, seem to take place in a kind of seemingly uniform global kind of discourse. So it's often very instructive to anchor it in particular discussions and debates and places. But from that scale of deep time, Revanta, with you, I'm going to zero in on shifting the ground now quite dramatically. As a dancer, as a Bharatanatyam dancer, you have what might be called a particular, if you will, trained audience, which clearly, like all such audiences, relies on notions of tradition and conditioning and education in that discipline, right? So could you tell us about how you've come to introduce themes like the glimpse that you gave us of downstairs into this discipline, this practice, and into its audience?
So Ranjit, as you know, I was born into a family of dancers, and I'm a third generation dancer in my family. My grandmother was considered one of the pioneers in the 30s and 40s to have taken Bharatanatyam from its source, from the small villages in Tamil Nadu where she went to study it, and to bring it not just to northern parts of the country in India, but also subsequently to other parts of the world. So I, in a sense, inherited Bharatanatyam as an art form. Some of my earliest childhood memories are of waking up to the sound of dance classes that started as early as 7 in the morning, because we used to live upstairs from the dance academy, and having to walk across the dance floor to go to school every day. So it was kind of inescapable. I must have been about 14 or 15 when, having already had several years of training in dance, that I decided, okay, no matter what else I did, I wanted dance to be a part of my life, a part of my career, my profession. And already at that time, I had seen a lot of the work that my grandmother had created and the work that my mother had started to create. And both of them, in their own ways, and in the times that they were creating work, groundbreakingly so, used classical dance to break out of this tradition of purely telling stories from mythology. In my grandmother's case, in the 70s and 80s, she, for the first time, used classical dance to talk about things that weren't about beauty, but things that were ugly, like casteism, like dowry deaths and violence against women. And this is something that my mother's work continued to do. So the use of classical dance to talk about things other than what they have been, what it has been used to talk about over the past several centuries, was already something that I was growing up with. funnily enough, as a teenager, I kind of wanted to not do that at all. I wanted to learn the dance and I wanted to do what it was meant to do. I wanted my dance to be about beauty and aesthetic, and so it was a kind of a roundabout journey that later in my career I seem to have come back to. I never met my grandfather, but something that he told my mother often, and that I kind of subsequently heard, was that if you're born into a privileged family, that privilege comes with a sense of responsibility to do something with that privilege. And I think I started to realize that this art form that I had inherited was so powerful in terms of its ability to communicate ideas, its ability to reach out to people and to really move people, that it was a shame not to use it to talk about things that really need to be talked about. And I think for me personally, this journey started in around 2010-11. I was a student in the UK doing my master's, and I was trying to continue my career as a Bharatanatyam dancer, and I would try and get little gigs here and there. And I realized that the stories that I was dancing didn't have that same kind of connect with the Western audience because they didn't have the context. They didn't grow up with these stories that they could see and immediately connect to. And so I felt a need to start telling different kinds of stories. I also realized that while I had spent an entire lifetime dancing about Shiva and Parvati or Rama and Krishna, that I've never been a religious person. I don't feel this sense of deep bhakti or devotion that some people do. And so I felt a need to dance about things that I really felt passionate about and that I really believed in more so. And so that's how it ended up being a conversation between my mother and I, where I said, I want to continue doing classical Bharatanatyam without, moving away from the classicism or the sort of quote-unquote purity of the form. And yet, I want to make it relevant to the people that I'm performing for, to the life that I live. And we started to create short pieces that were based in the traditional repertoire. So Bharatanatyam as a form has an incredibly large repertoire of pieces, many which have been performed, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And these are in set formats. The kirtan, like I mentioned earlier downstairs, is one of these, right? It's a devotional song where the dancer describes and talks about a deity. The padam, which is a love song. The varnam, which is a storytelling format. And so what we started to do was to use these formats, but to inject them with new ideas, with new subject matter. Sometimes we started challenging stereotypes that exist in these classical stories. So for example, the love song, the padams are almost always performed by a female dancer. And the love song is directed towards the dancer, the heroine's lover or husband, who is very often away fighting a war or on an adventure. And the naika, the heroine, is sitting, waiting, pining for his return. And I thought, times have changed. The love songs have to change. So we wrote a new kind of padam set in today's world. If you look at the classic tales, love stories were always amidst nature. Somehow nature has always been a recurring theme. So the lover speaks of her love to the birds and to the trees, to the clouds, in Kalidasa's Meghaduta. Messages of love are sung to the clouds. And the Naika says, travel with the winds and rain on the land where my lover is so that he may feel that I miss him. And of whatever nature is left around us, we don't talk to it. We have cloud computing that transmits our messages. And so we wrote a love song about a young man who is separated from his girlfriend. He's in a long-distance relationship. And he's trying to get a hold of her. And her phone goes to voicemail, and she's not on Skype. And all of this is done through 100% classical Bharatanatyam. And that was the idea, to push the limits of the form itself, to see how much can one stretch it without really changing it. And it's, as we discovered, an incredibly versatile form that can talk about Skype and emails and things like that. So that's kind of how this journey started. I started telling personal stories of the 21st century, and then universal stories. And then I started telling stories about things that I cared about and that I felt like I needed to talk about. So that's sort of how I arrived here.
Thank you for... Is it on now? Yeah, it is. Thank you so much for that account of your journey, because as you were speaking, it also struck me that you're drawing on a family background that also includes seminal contributors to science, and your uncle is one of the early scientists who recognized the need to actually start a whole new domain of environmental education. So much of that seems to appear in the work you do, and we'll come back to that. But I want to draw Cyrus into this conversation again. Cyrus, in the work you've done, you've been strongly invested in thinking through new forms of urbanization, of how to manage metropolitan growth. But also there's been another part of your work where you've been focused on preserving biodiversity. Your association with the BEAG, the Bombay Environmental Action Group, had a lot to do with saving nature as sanctuary. So is there a contradiction there? Is there a necessary contradiction between just the fact that our patterns of habitation spread at a certain scale, and these are irreversible processes? How, in your own work, how do you manage this contradiction?
So you posed the contradiction between two possible domains, that of the urban and that of nature. I'm involved in a triple contradiction, which is side by side with this, I'm supposed to run a business. And so it has been a sort of a triple tightrope walk. I don't think actually the distinction between the urban and the rural when it comes to environment is a distinction that needs to worry us. I think all of us, we draw our sustenance from the earth. We draw all the pharmacology of our medicine from the natural world. We need to breathe air and drink water that is pure and unpolluted. So whether we live in a city or we live in the countryside, I think we cannot dispute the fact that a healthy society is based upon a healthy natural environment. So I think these two have to go together. And I think that there are many businesses that recognize that fundamentally they cannot continue to carry out an activity which begins to hurt the environment in which they operate. And that's why, in a way, why fossil fuel industries have now come into such ill favor. But I think there are some companies that have always tried to do the right thing, both abroad and in India. And that only works if their owners and their shareholders believe that they're stakeholders and not only the shareholders who need a profit, but also their employees who need to be treated well if they are going to deliver well, and also the community Because if the community no longer wants to buy your products, or the environment of the community can no longer provide the sustenance you need for your raw materials, then your business also is at risk. Okay, so having said that, I hesitate to say anything about how a city like Bombay could be and should be better run, except to say that if you look at the cities across the world that are well managed, they're well managed because there are a number of disciplines that are integrated at the government level in order to deliver to citizens a quality of living that with the passage of time should keep improving rather than going backwards, as is happening in our city. So when a number of friends of ours, including Shirish Patel, the engineer Rakesh Mohan, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, Jamshid Godrej, Xerxes Desai of Titan, and a few of us others, we said, cities are going to hell. What is missing? Then we looked at the way in which Bombay city is governed. So you have municipal corporations. Just in Greater Bombay alone, you don't have only the BMC, you also have a corporation in Thane, you have corporations across the river or the creek at Navi Mumbai. In fact, you have a total of 9 municipal corporations and 20 more municipal councils. But they all are subsumed under one super planning authority called the Mumbai Metropolitan Region Development Authority, the MMRDA. So when we were thinking about all of this, we said, let's go and have a chat with the MMRDA and let's talk to the chief town planner. It turns out that they had only one qualified town planner in the entire MMRDA. And by the way, she's now retired. So we said, well, what does this mean? And then as we tried to put together a curriculum to teach urban planning, there is no such thing as just a simple planning discipline. Urban planning is highly interdisciplinary. So if you wanted to look at the constituents of intellectual thinking that go into planning a city, you obviously have to look at the basic planning requirements, which are that you have to map a city and develop a land use plan for the city. And these gorgeous maps which Bombay used to produce over the years, called the Development Plan for Bombay, have now, with the added advantage of computerization, seriously degraded in quality. The original maps were hand-drawn, right down to the level where in every ward you could see a letterbox, a lamppost, and a manhole cover. There's still an attempt to do this, but it's not done with the degree of accuracy that used to be the case originally. So you need the ability to do simple planning. But you also have to worry about how people work and where they live. And so you have to look at the whole process of delivering housing, which is affordable to people. You have to look at office and industrial location policy. And you have to look at transportation to allow people to get from their place of work to their place of residence in a reasonable period of time. Then you have to look at all the amenities. So you look at open space planning, recreation and sports. That takes you into the domain of economics. You look at social sciences. Then you have project management, because you have to deliver infrastructure. You have to look at law. So by the time you look at all of these different elements that go into a town planning curriculum, you realize that actually speaking, most of these disciplines are missing when it comes to the way in which the planning of a city like Bombay is both conceptualized and implemented. It's not surprising, because town planning or urban planning is not a course in which you can get a degree in this country. All urban planning is an adjunct to schools of architecture and planning. So when you go to study architecture, you could do a couple of electives in planning. So there's this huge, big deficiency. So just an anecdote. So one of us went abroad and said, where do we find the best example of an urban planning university. So there's one in Rotterdam and there's one in MIT. So the guys in MIT said, why are you coming to us? We plan for cities of 2 to 3 million people in the States. You want us to plan a city of 18, 20 million people? You better teach us how to do that. But we said, how do the Chinese do it? And they said, well, you know, MIT puts its courses out on the net. They're all open and online. You can, if you wish to, go and listen to lectures and read the courses of MIT in virtually any discipline right now. So the Chinese sent out a team, and this is 25 or 30 years ago, to MIT to pick up whatever they could about how urban planning, what the constituent disciplines are. And then they went back to China. They called over a whole team from MIT, and together they wrote a new curriculum for Chinese universities. Today, Chinese universities turn out 4,000 qualified town planners every year. And we don't effectively produce one. So I think this is one of the root causes. Now, then you could look at a whole lot of other things, which is that our bureaucracy has now become non-functional. And one of the reasons why a bureaucracy in India is non-functional is that bureaucrats have loyalties in a particular direction which doesn't serve the city. A bureaucrat's loyalties are in two directions. A bureaucrat or a government officer has a loyalty to his immediate superior, and he has a loyalty to reading the rules precisely. He is at risk if he doesn't do either of those correctly. But there's nothing at all in the spirit or the letter of municipal governance which says that their job is to create a better environment for the citizens, that it is their job to provide services to the citizens that work. It is their job to respond to citizens. So you have a whole dysfunctional climate and attitude operating there. So I leave it at that just now. But the other element which is deeply ingrained is corruption. If you talk to anyone who is in the construction business, you could ask them, why have you not volunteered? You're a great construction company. Why haven't you volunteered to build roads in the city? And the answer that you'll get is, of course, we've been to the municipal corporation, we've received their tenders, and after we submit our reply, the first question that we're asked is, how long is this road going to last that you're building? And you say, well, maybe 7, 8 years? And they say, no, it must not last for more than 2 years. And the kickback could go up to 40%. So this is a malaise that not only covers Bombay City, but covers the state roads across the, I don't know, some of you may be driving to Alibag occasionally. What is the state of that road every monsoon? The road doesn't exist by the time you get to the month of August or September. And then there's a contract given to repair the road. Now, if you look at this, this goes through in every aspect of city development. It goes through in the case of garbage clearance. Solid waste management is picked up by private contractors, but they are paid by the weight that they deliver at the garbage dump. So they will, en route, if necessary, pick up debris. There's areas from which they can pick up a large number of bricks. They go down to the garbage dump and they get paid for the kilos that they deliver, rather than for having kept the streets clean. And as you know now, they're trying to enforce segregation of garbage everywhere. So that theory is well established. So in societies, there's stringent rules for separating garbage. But you go down and see when the garbage trucks arrive, and they'll pick up the dry garbage and the wet garbage and put that into the same vehicle. So you can also see that traffic is designed, the traffic intersections are designed by traffic police who don't drive cars. And so this problem goes all the way down. So let me stop here, but we can talk about later on what is the effect of this in terms of distortions that you see in the city. The coastal road is one such, but there have been many, many more earlier on.
It's a depressing account, but all the more depressing because we've had experiments, even in Bombay, with thinking about these things. I'm thinking of someone like Patrick Geddes, for instance, who was a sociologist who had ideas on town planning and the relationship between urbanization and the environment. Also, visionary experiments in making new cities. Everyone thinks of Corbusier, of course, but there's also Königsberger, who built Bhubaneswar. And many of these visionary experiments intended to balance the costs of habitation on the environment with the possibility of a more utopian form of being. But I want to turn to you, Revanta, with a set of thoughts that comes out of this, which is that this is an affliction particularly of the visual arts, not so in theater and films, but in cinema. But it tends to happen that there's a certain kind of art making which tends to objectify the things it picks up from outside the art world. Yeah, and there's, I mean, in the visual arts, we have this series of the pedagogical turn, the ethnographic turn, the research turn. And often that proceeds in a cocoon of its own without a connection to practical politics, in a way that does not happen in theater or in cinema, where there's a far closer connection to people's movements, movements of protest and dissidence, for instance. Now, in your work, could I draw you out on how, you know, in one sense, your work addresses an audience of people within dance, within the cultural domain, coming from the kind of background of activism that you do? Have you reached out to people involved in material politics? Or is there a sense that you might need to ally yourself with larger social or political movements?
You know, I think for me personally, and the sort of family lineage that I'm a part of, the idea of using the performing arts as a medium of communication, I think, is very much at the center of it. So it's not art for art's sake. It is art as a way to reach people's minds and hearts. And I think for me, the approach that I have always taken has been to use this tool, this craft that I have, to talk about things that matter to me, and to address issues that I perceive my audience is either interested in or needs to be engaged in, without running the risk of the work becoming didactic or preachy. I don't have solutions to offer, but I can ask questions that I feel we can all start thinking about together. You know, I through my master's and through my education, I've studied art history and the development of art movements. And I think when one looks at it academically, these movements are sort of clearly defined. But artists didn't wake up and say, I'm going to be an impressionist, or, you know, these were genres or techniques that developed organically as a response to the society and times they lived in, and as a response to the artists that came before them, sometimes as a rejection of classical ideas. And in Europe and the West, you see this rejection more clearly when contemporary dancers or modern dancers sort of wanted to get away from this colonial idea of classical ballet, which was part of the royal courts, and there was a kind of a rejection of that. In India, you see more an evolution of form and style, and very often new movements are built on techniques or earlier schools of art. And I think so this has always been a kind of an organic process. I don't think I've ever thought of creating a work that fits a certain school, or that necessarily presents a certain school of thought or a certain political ideology. I think it is very much something which is intuitive and that comes as a instinctive reaction to what is happening around me.
But we could open it up. It's been like an hour. Or am I imagining this? No. Would you like to? Could we open it up to questions? Sure. Yeah.
And then we can
And we come exactly. Yeah. Because you've both made your expositions in a degree of detail and they've been substantial. So I have a sense that maybe if people want to respond, if you have questions, we could do that and then we could go back into another round if I have lots of questions. So if...
I was thinking when I was hearing Cyrus speak during both parts of how kind of these things come together. We're talking about anthropology and then urban planning, and then we're talking about sort of dance and the performing arts. And I think one of the things that perhaps you didn't mention when it came to urban planning was a space for culture. You talked about recreation and sport. And I think one of the things that this capitalist ideology has done is that it has put culture into this bracket of entertainment, of something which is an add-on and not integral to society, to living life. And I think, arts and culture add to a certain enrichment of life that we don't realize what it takes away when it is bracketed as entertainment, as something which is superfluous. Over civilizations, the arts have developed alongside everything else, and I think we need to start looking at, as we think about coping with our current situation, in terms of how to build and manage cities better and how to kind of improve our quality of life, how the arts and culture can kind of be brought back into the mainstream, not in terms of entertainment, but in terms of building better citizens, better human beings. And perhaps that's where some of these things come together, I think.
So I think I must thank you, Revanta. That was a glaring, unforgivable omission on my part, okay? But I will only say this, that I was trying to avoid getting into too much detail, but one of the...
No, but it is something that...
No, it's...
is true the world over, right?
Well, but there are certain city governments that understand the value of art and culture. Some of them, in fact, create that into the USP for their own city. Also, taxation systems allow some philanthropists to donate in a large way. It's only recently that the CSR funding requirement has been broadened somewhat to bring within its ambit, for example, heritage conservation, and I hope it'll go further from there straight into the arts. But one of the essential requirements when you write a city plan, and the city plan of Bombay, the development plan which was put out a year or two ago, is a document that will disappoint you, because you would expect that the very first chapter of the document would be a statement of intent, of the philosophy behind the plan and what the plan is intended to achieve. But there is no such thing. It goes straight into water, sanitation, transportation, etc. And indeed, all of these departments in any way are treated in silos within government. So one of the first things that we did with the author of this was Shirish Patel, was that we wrote out a set of guiding principles that must dictate the intention of the plan. And these principles very much included the ability of citizens to enjoy clean air and water, to be able to, in an island city like us, to be able to have access to the sea and to enjoy the views, particularly to ensure that there is heritage conservation, that people can enjoy and take pride in their heritage and their early culture, for sure, and that there must be open spaces. And open spaces, by the way, must be never more than 2 bus stops away from any habitation, so that kids can either walk to play football or get to a park. So I'll park that for a moment. But I think what was interesting in listening to Revanta, if I may now respond to you, is that you combined in your little talk exactly what the subject heading was. Because you're an artist, and you described how, through your dance, you convey messages. I think that's what an activist does. And so I think increasingly we are seeing today how artists are realizing something very profound. If we look at climate change, I think one of the things that worries people who are involved in climate change, but it's so interesting that it worries the artist community, is that we are getting these terrifying scenarios described to us. More recently, the one for Bombay, when they found that all the measurements they're taking by satellite are off by a big margin, and actually we're in for flooding much earlier than we thought. And very likely the ice caps in Greenland and Antarctica are also melting much faster than we thought. So how does this strike us? We actually remain somewhat indifferent. But the moment that any of us has a personal experience of an environmental tragedy, we begin to worry. So the forest fires that regularly ravage the hillsides of Los Angeles and San Francisco don't really bother people until their own homes get burnt and they lose a member of the family. Then it begins to strike them. And I think artists are saying today that it's only through art that we might be able to touch the emotions of people, and therefore we can use art as a way of bridging this gap between your intellectual understanding of climate change, which you don't feel, and the fact that you must be able to feel emotionally that there is a crisis upon us. All sorts of exciting things happening, by the way, with regard to performing arts. I was interested to read. Have you heard of this wonderful thing called warming stripes, which was an idea put forward by a chap called Ed Hawkins? He is a professor of climate change at the University of Reading. So he was wondering, he spent all his time, scientists spend a lot of time trying to convey graphically what they have in graphs and in equations. So being a climate scientist, he said, why don't I go back, say, I think he went back 600 or 700 years, and let me look at the temperature year by year by year. And what he did was he created a horizontal band of vertical stripes, which looks like a barcode, where the normal temperature is purple, cooler temperatures are blue, and warmer temperatures are red. And so he created this band, which mostly purple and blue, and then gets redder and redder to a dark red when you come to the present time. And that suddenly became a visual that went viral. 180 million of these images have been downloaded on the net and so on. And he then worked on another way. He called it the climate spiral. So he did a series of concentric circles, which also change color as the timeline expands. So then I didn't realize, but there's some sort of a movement called tempestry. Have you heard of that? You must have heard of it. Well, tempestry is, I suppose, an acronym for, or a combination of the words tempest and tapestry. So you had this lady who's a very famous craftsperson, and she decided, being inspired by these warming stripes, to crochet into a scarf, which, by the way, became a gigantically long scarf. Again, these colors. And she exhibited it at a science congress. She is, by the way, a physicist. And she exhibited it at a science congress. And she said, what struck me was, after I explained what the color scheme was, the number of scientists who were experts in climate science went up there and said, you know, it's year by year. I want to see what it was like in the year that I was born. And she said, here was an example of art that straight away touched individuals in a graphic way that couldn't be done. There were others there was one lady in New York, you know, I wish somebody would do this in Bombay, when this information came out that, you know, New York is going to flood catastrophically. I don't know how the artist got the permission to the planning authorities, but they looked at the different levels at which the water would rise into the city. So quite a couple of miles inland, they were drawing waves on the pavement and saying, this will be 2056. And then further up, what would happen in maybe 2060? And suddenly people say, oh, if all of this is going to be underwater, then we have something to worry about. And I think that in a very dramatic way, artists are now being able to cross a sort of a barrier in people's minds and emotions about climate change in a way that newspapers, maps, and professors are not able to do yet.
Just to add, I mean, we had the opportunity, as Avid and Opera House, we hosted the BBC film, Seven Worlds, One Planet. Sir David Attenborough's film. It was really interesting because we had this opportunity, but you know, we filled the whole room with students, school kids, and it was done in a couple of cities simultaneously, and the filmmakers were patched in by video conferencing. But I think this whole thing is, you know, what we're talking about. I think the importance is to reach the young ones today. How do you impact, kind of educate them and start making them think, because it's their planet to look after. Today, I think I sent you that article by, I think by 2030 or 2050, you know, Bombay is going to be flooded, parts of it. And I said, oh, but I may not be around at that point, but it's really sad. So just, I think, you know, educating the young of today is the most important thing, I think, to looking after your planet. And that BBC film, I mean, there's a series of 5, and we did one of them. So hopefully we'll have the opportunity to spread that message through.
I think you're right. We adults have just messed it up, haven't we? But the important thing is not that kids should be educated, but that kids should begin to feel it here. The University of Minnesota is doing some remarkable things. I don't know if you're dancing there, but again, they've got scientists. They've got a scientist who's a cellist, by the way. So he decided that he would, again, inspired by the warning stripes, create a musical score where he would associate a pitch or a sound with a degree. So he then creates a musical score with the sounds correlating to the way in which the climate has changed over the years. So now there's a junior chamber orchestra which is doing the same, and they're writing their own scores and so on. So I think once the message goes through, then people will begin to start really doing things about it. Whereas our generation, my generation, the Jurassic generation, has lost it. And of course, that's why all citizens here should be really worried about that coastal road. Because that coastal road is going far out to the sea, and if you cut a section of it from, say, Warden Road up to the end of the wall, they have to raise the height of that wall in order to make it non-vulnerable to rising sea levels, and they realize that. So you'll have a slope of land coming from the outer seawall down into Warden Road and Nepean Road. So if it rains heavily, then you know where the water is going to end up.
Hi, Cyrus. Hi, Ranjit, and hi, Zanuka. So it's been very heartening to hear all that's happening here. It's also been a little worrying at Futures for Friday. We meet every Friday at various stations, and Extinction Rebellion, it's shrinking. And I wish more of us artists would be out there, because a 14-year-old kid was taken to the police station for saying "Save RA" outside Bandra Station because we weren't there that day. And it's really depressing what's happening because there's not enough of us out there. The other day there was 3 of us on Marine Drive for climate change thing. This whole Greta Thunberg, it's gotten quite viral online. Everyone's there, yay, thumbs ups, etc. But on Marine Drive at Churchgate Station, 7 of us. Bandra Station, 5 of us. And I'm ridiculous. I do half an hour at Bandra Station, jump into a fast train, come to Churchgate, then go to Marine Drive, and they're like 3 people, 5 people. We need to put our arts out there. We need to put our energy out there. We need to get not only the kids, because we need policy change. And we need the corporates to push that. And it is depressing with the C wrote RA. We were not allowed to say the word RA on the streets. The police decide that suddenly, and you go like, you can't tell us what not to say. So thank you for this, but yeah, we need to be bigger. Thanks so much. My question would be, how can the arts and maybe, the musings and other arts put more paintings out there, put out on hoardings, maybe graffiti on the walls, let's paint the city up with it. Dance on the street. So I wanted to have a party at Haji Ali and have a dance party in the middle of Haji Ali to stop traffic there when they started the work there. There was 2 of us. Thank you. So how can we make it viral and bigger?
It's quite a stunning image, isn't it? That Revanta dancing like Lord Shiva doing the Tandava on the middle of Marine Drive and holding up all the traffic the moment the municipal commissioner's car goes by.
We actually talked about doing that.
Yeah. But I was interested with Extinction Rebellion just now. Are you part of Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah.
Okay, Extinction Rebellion is I've been thinking a lot about your movement because more recently there's been a feeling that if you want to do something about climate change, you have to protest, you have to fight. It's extremely difficult for individuals to change governments and even more so to hold back the irresistible change in climate. But there are some parallels because Mahatma Gandhi won independence for India through a civil disobedience, non-cooperation movement without using violence. Yes.
XR over here, we call it XR for short, is trying the non-cooperative and the peaceful way. We can't protest because we're not allowed to protest. We're not allowed to gather in more than 4 people. They're just blanketing this 144 on us all the time. So we're doing the peaceful thing. We're doing lying down and pretending to be dead and things like that. They let us do that for 7 minutes. And they said, Abhi niklo yahan se. We're not doing anything. We're just lying down.
So it's irresponsible of me to say so, but what if you didn't obey? What if
they put people away in the van.
They take you away in a van, and then they release you after a couple of hours.
But full Saturday.
But you. That's a terrible day to be locked up, isn't it?
And they lied to the lawyers that we weren't in there when the lawyers came to take us out. So it's turning into a battle for being a peaceful protester, not even protesting. We were walking to RA and we got picked up and thrown into a van. So it's like getting a little difficult, and how do we push that?
In RA, after protest cases are launched and now cases are withdrawn. Now in RA, again a new committee has been formed to find a new place for car shed, and which has to give report in 15 days. And I think there is one artist. I don't know in how in 15 days they will give the report. And second matter, putting not art way, in I think next week or next 2 weeks, Supreme Court is hearing Coastal Road decision. So that may be either amended and coastal work will start, because Supreme Court has always been that. And if I speak, I can be arrested also for contempt of court.
Talking of Gandhi, he brought about independence to whatever degree with the cheapest, most ordinary cloth, which nobody wanted, rough, tough, difficult to wash. today we need to eat organic. Well, those of us who are lucky enough to eat 2-3 times a day, if you buy organic food, the vendors will supply it. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, sometimes it's a fraud. You do the best you can. But that is a very basic change that everyone needs to make. My own fight began 50 years ago because of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and never looked back from that. But a lot of our things, we have meetings like this. We are all very elegant. What is the change? I have started using the bus maybe twice a week, and I find it a very comfortable, convenient way to go in non-rush hours. And somebody like me, then I speak to the driver. Can you stop honking? May I talk to you? Far more respectfully to him than I would talk to you, because I have something to say to him. So if not me, who is supposed to change? If not now, when? That is how I look at it. And we, the well-off, create the garbage. The poor merely live in it. And regarding the paper waste and compostable waste, I find if I keep my paper separate and plastic separate in a neat, clean heap, for years I bypass the municipality. I just give it to the ladies on the road, preferably ladies, because they are feeding children. I buy my food from vendors on the street where possible, because they need my 2 rupee profit more than big grand companies. So if not me, who is supposed to change? That is all. If not public transport, if I can't use it, why should I tell someone else to use it? So that's it.
And yeah, going along with the similar sentiment of art is very important because it reflects what is happening in culture and all of that. But now what has happened is that it is an echo chamber. So no matter what good work is coming out, whether it's through the long scarf that was made and displayed to the scientists, it all comes down to people who know information, telling each other information and enabling them to find more information. So now even these scientists, they would have their studies, they would come out with reports. If it doesn't get implemented in policy and if it doesn't get internalized by corporations, then there's no point of all that information and there's no point of all that awareness. Now, in the West, this movement has, the climate movement has taken a much more radical turn because they have been disconnected from their environment for a much longer time. So for instance, corporations like Shell are very invested in their governments, which is why the actions that they have to take have to be radical, because that's the kind of change that they need. Here in India, we do already have a connection with our world, and yet all the art that comes out of it tends to be within that same area. So even if there is evolution that is happening in the form, if it is not accessible to the people, and the information is going to the people who are interested about that subject matter, then that doesn't really do much. And just like ma'am was saying just now about how so we have to choose. We can either say that we want systemic change, which means that most people who are in this room would be very big stakeholders of that systemic change, because they'll be able to cause it in a more direct and impactful manner by changing the priorities of whatever it is that they're doing. Or it could be an individual change, which comes down to public transportation, using less water and all of that. But then if you're going to say use less water but wash 2 cars, every day of the week, then that's not how it works. You have to prioritize that. Maybe washing my car is not that important. So now, if both of these principles are contradicting each other, then where does the intellectual space wala population fall in terms of responsibility? Because then if you're going to blame the system by saying, the bus is not good enough, but then also not use the powers that you have to influence the system, then there is a great imbalance. And the same thing also applies to art. So, which is why most subversive art forms like, meme culture being equated to Dadaism, that is accessible art, unfortunately, because the artists or the art that we are surrounded by is not really accessible. And it is wonderful. It has a lot to offer, so it should be made accessible. So my question, because what I was expecting through all this was about how to take it forward and how to take these ideas forward. So which is why I want to know, how can these ideas be actually influential beyond just piquing someone's thought of, oh, this is a reality that might not be directly related to us, but how hypothetically scary.
I think, we can talk about both sides of this. You can take examples like Gandhi, where one man and his action kind of led to this huge change. And we can talk about how a lot of us feel very often, which is like, I'm just one person, what can I do? What real impact can I have? And I think it's important for us to take the approach and say, just because I individually can't change everything doesn't mean that I shouldn't do anything at all. And I mean, yeah, I understand what you're saying in terms of like a certain hypocrisy that exists in us as a collective, where we talk about these things and we attend events, and yet in our everyday personal lives we don't do everything that we can do. And I think there's a certain level of apathy. We're just too used to the comforts of our lives. I don't know how one changes that on a large scale, but I know that in my own capacity as a dancer, as an artist, I try to talk about it as much as I can. I was just talking about a new production which I'm creating now, which, funnily, it kind of is very much in line with what you were saying. So I'm just beginning to work on my next production, which is called Climate Stories. And in an attempt to kind of move away from this abstraction of the scientific data and statistics that we get about climate change, like a 1.5 degree rise in global temperature or a 1 centimeter rise in ocean levels, which seems a bit, I don't know, absurd. It's like, 1 degree is whatever, right? Like, we don't really understand the implication of that. But when you see the life of a person that has completely been destroyed because their family was living through a climate disaster, it creates an emotional response. And so the idea of this production is to tell stories of real life people whose lives have been drastically impacted by climate change in an attempt to draw an emotional response. But within that, my collaborator, who is a composer and a musician, is sitting in France, and he has decided that he's going to stop taking flights as a personal action. And that's something that he had independently decided some time ago. And I was like, oh, we were just applying for this grant for you to come to India so we can work together on this. And I kind of, I respect and understand his decision. And therefore, we're working with the technology and through Skype and to develop this, right? So even within this idea of creating a show about climate change, he has this integrity to say, okay, I'm not even going to get on a flight to come there to work with you on this project because I want to avoid that carbon footprint. And it's amazing, and it's made me think a little more about, okay, what are other things that I can do other than just creating a show about it in my own life, in a sense. Yeah.
So you've raised a very difficult question. It's actually a philosophical question, if you think of it. I was tremendously influenced by a book written by Ramachandra Guha in 2006 called How Much Should a Person Consume? Is anybody familiar with that book? Has anybody read it? Really worth going back and revisiting. This guy wrote the book, 2006, 13 years ago. And he touches on exactly this question, that Western civilization is now, Ranjit used this awful word which I don't agree with called capitalocene or something, as opposed to anthropocene, suggesting that actually it's the whole capitalist system that has led to the exploitation of water, the decimation of forests, the pollution of air, and the exploitation of minerals. And in the process of doing all of this, you have displaced people. The displacement is really serious. We want 24-hour water in our taps. The municipality said you're going to get it. Where does it come from for a population that has gone from 2.5 million after independence to 18 million? It comes from further and further away in North Bombay, in fact beyond Bombay. So you had, once upon a time, Powai and Bihar gave all the water to the island city. Then they added Tansa, then they added Vaitarna, then they added Upper Vaitarna, then they added Bhatsai, then they added Bhatsai 2, then they added Bhatsai 3. Every time they built a hydro project to supply water to Bombay, they submerged forests and they displaced villages. And we are continuing to do this. So when we say we want 24-hour water and we are continuing to expand the population of the city, we should be mindful that we are displacing people and destroying forests, okay? So I think you have to talk about these things. It's not an echo chamber. I think this lady who knitted that scarf got a whole lot of people beginning to think about it. I bet you those scientists went home and talked to their wives and kids. And this merchandising is colossal that goes on. So yes, we are an echo chamber. I agree with you. But on the other hand, art is the one form that can reach out. And art tends to cut across race, culture, gender, urban, rural. And so, yeah.
But it doesn't cut across economic differences. So my point was about accessibility.
No, but just a moment. You're thinking about art in an art gallery. Yes, I think this is for the privileged. You know, but art extends all the way down into, and the performing arts do. I went to a performance by a dance group which comes from rural Karnataka and Kerala called the Kattaikuttu. It's a very simple form of Bharatanatyam. And yes, but there's a Rajagopal and his Dutch wife Hannah who have worked with these tribal groups. And there was a very strong message. They reenact the Mahabharata, but there was this dramatic scene when they tried to derobe Draupadi, and how in their version, Draupadi doesn't accept that. She, this yards and yards of beautiful Kerala silk keep coming out from behind the stage, but she's going round and round, and then she finally challenges, who would it be, Duryodhana? Yeah, to a game of dice. She's asserting her feminine gender. And he says, oh, and what's the bet? And she said, my chastity. Okay, and then she wins, and then she kicks the dice at him, and that's the end of the scene. But look how powerful that message is to a group of, women in society. So art does go beyond the frontiers of an art gallery. Now come on. And there's graffiti all over cities with warming stripes and so on. But that's only one part of it. I think, I'm sorry to take another minute. The point is, each of us has to ask ourselves the question that we are living in a highly wasteful, highly carbon footprint intensive society. We can do whatever we want to, and I laud what you're doing. It doesn't really make a difference to the climate. But if more and more people did it, then it might. There was that one image of a turtle which had a plastic straw stuck in its nose, and it took them ages to get it out. Plastic straws have been banned all over the world. Okay, so that's not an echo chamber. We've got to go beyond that. And that's why I think what you've said, Mr. Lalji, is that if you get kids to start worrying about these things, they begin to empathize with animals, so they begin to worry about species. They begin to understand the value of forests when you can take them there. It's a generational thing. If the climate doesn't overtake us by the end of the century, then I think the third generation, which will be born towards the end of the century, will want to safeguard the climate because of all of these conversations that we are having. We have to hope that we're not underwater by that time. One little thing, you mentioned Gandhi. This is something that's coming up in a publication which I had a chance to foresee. I didn't know that Gandhi had any aesthetic sense at all, because he's not written anything about aesthetics. But when he was in prison, there was an artist sitting with him, and they were looking at vegetable dyes. I don't know if you know that Gandhiji wrote a book called Vanaspatiyonu Rang. And there's this artist called Rafio, someone or the other. He's in the progressive movement. He's now created 300 shades of color, which he uses in his painting. And he said he was inspired by Gandhiji, who actually listed some 67 different shades of color that came from flowers, onion peels, the bark of trees, leaves. And there's this wonderful book, and he then creates a little book with all these little shades in it, and in his handwriting, Bengan Nurang, Gulab Nurang, all these lovely shades. And so that little work that he did in prison inspired artists to start looking at color. And you know, when politics oppresses you terribly, maybe just a painting with a beautiful color flower in it can relieve your gloom. And that is the way art speaks to people. And I think don't be cynical about the fact that this is an echo chamber. It can and does reach far beyond.
What you said, that the change has to come with art and culture, and you said it has to be from the 14-year-olds. I think change has to come at home. Maybe, I know a lot of it has gone to social media, maybe with 3 people appearing for a cause. But maybe if there were art salons like how we had in the early 20th century, when there was a progressive art group and there were art salons in Europe, and that's how art and culture comes into the children. Like you grow up hearing the ghungroos. You grow up with it. I think art and culture is something that you grow up with. So the idea would be probably to build art communities around you. Yeah, thank you.
Coincidentally, today, pre-primary section of Cathedral School had a project called Save the Planet. And full that space from next to the church was full of drawings and paintings by children. So I feel that the same, if can be repeated, exhibiting in other schools or other places, it was very inspiring. And almost 50 parents were there to help them to make children understand, and even the visitors understand, what are the aspects of climate change and what one can do and what is happening. They created one Amazon forest also. So I feel that maybe we can speak to them and create the same. It was very impressive. Everybody, and they invited yesterday many more schools also. So as we are saying that children are the best tools. Yeah. No, my grandchild was saying deforestation, pollution and everything, all big words.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if Greta Thunberg is any example to go by, maybe we need to do a fair amount of learning from, yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to thank Cyrus and Revanta for this very, very stimulating discussion, and all of you for being part of it and contributing to it. Thank you so much.